On the last night of freedom, she turned to the slave she was taught to ignore. 1860. On the last night before the auction, when the lanterns burned low and the house stood silent as a grave, she did something no one would have believed. The mistress of Ashford plantation stepped beyond the white pillars, past the manicured garden, and into the slave quarters she had been raised to avoid. By dawn, chains would tighten. By noon, families would be torn apart. By sunset, nothing would remain the same. But before the sun rose on 1860's cruel morning, she turned to the man she had been taught not to see, and made a choice that would shatter her world forever. If you enjoy powerful historical stories that feel real and unforgettable, don't forget to subscribe and like the channel. The year was 1860, and Ashford plantation sat heavy under the humid Louisiana sky. Eliza Whitmore had been a wife for 3 years and a widow for 6 months. Her husband's sudden fever had left her with debts she did not understand and land she did not know how to manage. The cotton fields stretched endlessly, but the books told a different story: loss, decline, and whispers of bankruptcy. Raised to believe in order and distance, Eliza had never questioned the structure of her world. The enslaved workers rose before dawn. They labored. They returned to their cabins. She remained on the veranda, gloved and composed. Among them was Samuel, quiet, observant, and known for fixing anything broken. Fences, wheels, tools. He spoke little, but when he did, others listened. Eliza knew his name only because her late husband had once called for him sharply across the yard. Samuel, see to the south gate. That was the extent of her knowledge. But times were changing. Rumors of war drifted through town like smoke. Prices had fallen. Creditors had begun to circle. And tomorrow, an auction was scheduled. Not just for cotton, for people. Eliza stood by her window that night, listening to the distant murmur of voices from the quarters. She had been taught that distance preserved dignity. Yet something inside her, something restless and newly awakened, would not allow her to close the shutters. For the first time in her life, she wondered what freedom truly meant. And before the night ended, she would step into a world she had never dared to enter. The night air was thick with the scent of magnolia and distant river water when Eliza Whitmore did what her mother would have called unthinkable. She stepped down from the veranda. The gravel path felt foreign beneath her slippers. For years, she had watched the slave quarters from a distance, their lanterns flickering like a separate constellation at the edge of her world. Tonight, those small lights felt closer, human. As she approached, voices softened. Conversations paused. Samuel was standing near a low fire, mending a wooden crate with steady hands. The glow of the flames caught the edge of his face, revealing quiet strength in a weariness that did not belong to a single day's labor, but to years. When he noticed her, he straightened slowly. "Ma'am," he said carefully. The single word held no warmth, but no defiance either. Only caution. Eliza felt every eye upon her. For the first time in her life, she was not protected by height or distance. I won't keep you long," she said, her voice thinner than she expected. "I came to speak about tomorrow." A murmur rippled through the gathered families. Tomorrow needed no explanation. Samuel's jaw tightened. "There's nothing left to speak on, ma'am. The wagons arrive at sunrise." His tone was respectful, yet firm. It unsettled her, not because it was improper, but because it was honest. Eliza had spent the afternoon with ledgers spread across her desk. Columns of numbers bled into one another. Debts outweighed assets. The plantation could not survive another season. The bank in Baton Rouge had made its position clear: sell or lose everything. But as she stood there, surrounded by mothers holding children closer than usual, by men whose silence carried dignity rather than submission, the word everything shifted its meaning. "I did not understand," she admitted softly. "Not until now." Samuel studied her face as though searching for mockery. Finding none, He spoke more quietly. My wife is on that list, he said. My boy too. They'll be sent south. I'll likely be sent north. That's how it works. The matter-of-fact delivery struck harder than anger would have. You speak as though it is already done, Eliza whispered. It usually is. A long silence followed. Crickets hummed in the grass. Somewhere beyond the trees, a steamboat whistle echoed along the Mississippi. Eliza felt something crack inside her, something built from years of obedience to a system she had never questioned. She had inherited not just land, but lives. And tomorrow, she would tear those lives apart. Samuel, she said, lowering her voice, if there were another way. His eyes flickered with something dangerous. Hope. There ain't been another way for us before, ma'am. She hesitated. Then, for the first time, she crossed the invisible boundary fully and stepped closer to the firelight. The papers, she said. They're signed, but they are not yet filed in town. If the bank cannot claim the sale by noon tomorrow. Samuel's breath stilled. You're talking about stopping it. I'm talking about delaying it, she corrected quickly, though even she heard the tremor of uncertainty. If I ride to Baton Rouge at first light and renegotiate, if I put the house itself as collateral. Gasps whispered around them. The house is all you have left, Samuel said. And you? She replied, meeting his gaze steadily. What do you have left? The question lingered between them, heavy as the humid night. For the first time, the barrier of title, mistress and enslaved, felt fragile. Not erased, but cracked. Samuel looked at the faces around him, his wife clutching their child, elders standing straight despite age. If you do this, he said carefully, you'll lose your standing in town. They'll say you've lost your sense. Eliza gave a small, almost broken smile. Perhaps I have, she said. Or perhaps I am only just finding it. Above them, thunder rumbled faintly in the distance. A storm was coming. And by morning, either the chains would tighten, or Ashford plantation would begin to unravel in a way no one could predict. Dawn did not wait for courage. The sky over Ashford plantation turned a pale, merciless gray as wagons rolled up the dirt drive. Their wheels cut deep into the soil still damp from the night's threatened storm. The men who rode them wore clean coats and blank expressions. To them, this was business. To everyone else, it was judgment. Eliza had not slept. Before first light, she had saddled her late husband's horse and ridden hard toward Baton Rouge, her skirts tied high, her gloved hands blistered by rains she had never truly learned to manage. Each mile felt like a rebellion against everything she had been taught. Back at the plantation, Samuel stood among the others as names were called. A clerk unfolded a long sheet of paper. Mary Carter and child. Samuel's wife stiffened beside him. He felt the air leave his lungs. Then, from the edge of the property, came the unmistakable thunder of hooves. Heads turned. Eliza rode through the gates with mud splashed to her waist and something fierce in her eyes. She did not look like a proper Southern widow anymore. She looked like someone who had crossed a line and did not intend to return. Stop this, she called, her voice cutting through the morning. The auctioneer frowned. M.R.S. Whitmore, these proceedings are lawful and scheduled. She dismounted without assistance. The bank has agreed to a stay. The sale cannot proceed. Murmurs spread quickly. The clerk adjusted his spectacles. On what grounds? Eliza's breath trembled, but her voice did not. I have signed over the main house and northern fields as collateral. The debt is restructured. The people listed here are no longer to be sold. Silence. The auctioneer's polite expression hardened. You are wagering your inheritance. I am preserving it, she replied. The bank representative stepped forward, unfolding a fresh document sealed in wax. He examined it slowly, then gave a reluctant nod. For 90 days, he said. No sale. The tension did not dissolve. It shifted. Samuel felt Mary's fingers tighten around his sleeve. 90 days was not freedom, but it was breath. It was time. Yet the reprieve came at a price. By noon, word had reached town. Neighbors arrived under the pretense of concern, their eyes sharp with judgment. One elderly planter removed his hat stiffly. "You've aligned yourself against your own kind, Mrs. Whitmore." Eliza stood straighter than she had in years. "I have aligned myself with what is right." "Right?" he echoed coldly. "You jeopardize order. You risk insurrection. You weaken the South when it must stand firm." She felt the weight of their stares. For the first time, she was truly alone among them. "I will not profit from tearing families apart," she said. A younger man scoffed. "And what do you imagine happens in 90 days? The world will not change because you had a change of heart." Perhaps he was correct. But something else had already changed. That evening, as the angry visitors rode away and the wagons retreated down the dusty road, Ashford plantation stood strangely quiet. Samuel approached the veranda at sunset, stopping at its base, not crossing, not assuming. "You've made enemies today," he said evenly. Eliza looked out over the fields that might soon no longer belong to her. "I had friends," she answered softly. "Now I have clarity." He studied her carefully. 90 days won't break the system." "No," she agreed. "But it may break this plantation free from it." A risky plan had begun forming in her mind during that desperate ride. Sell portions of unused land. Convert the estate into paid labor. Petition under new state tensions that were already straining old laws. War loomed on the horizon. Everyone felt it. If the nation was about to tear itself apart, perhaps Ashford could be remade before it did. But as twilight deepened, a rider appeared once more at the gate. Not from the bank, not from town. A messenger from New Orleans carried news that would shake them further. Louisiana's leaders were preparing to secede from the Union. War was no longer rumor. It was coming. And in the chaos of a nation dividing, Eliza's gamble might either secure freedom or destroy them all. The news of secession spread across Louisiana like wildfire through dry cane. Within weeks, uncertainty replaced routine. Militia drills echoed in nearby towns. Young men rode past Ashford plantation wearing new gray uniforms and restless expressions. The world that had once felt immovable was beginning to tilt. And with it, Eliza Whitmore's fragile gamble. The 90-day stay from the bank had bought time, but it had also drawn scrutiny. Neighbors no longer visited politely. They watched. They whispered. A woman who defied custom in such a season was not easily forgiven. One evening, Samuel approached the veranda again. He did not stand at the base this time. He remained in the yard, but closer than before. "Men were asking about you in town," he said quietly. "They say you're planning something." Eliza folded the letter in her hands. It was from the bank, reminding her of the ticking deadline. "They are correct," she replied. Over the past weeks, she had begun meeting privately with a lawyer from New Orleans, one sympathetic to gradual reform, though careful with his words. The legal pathways were narrow, dangerous. But there were precedents. Manumission under specific conditions. Contracts for paid agricultural labor in border territories. It would not free everyone at once, but it would begin. "I intend to restructure the plantation," she said, her voice steady. "Sell the southern acreage to cover the debt entirely. Convert Ashford into a wage-based farm. Those who wish to remain will be paid." Samuel studied her carefully. "And those who don't wish to remain?" She met his eyes. "They will leave with papers granting them lawful status." The words felt revolutionary even spoken aloud. Yet danger shadowed the plan. 2 nights later, that danger arrived. A group of masked riders stormed through the gates under darkness. They did not enter the house, but they circled it, torches raised high enough to threaten. A warning. "Stay in your place," one voice shouted from the shadows. or lose more than land. From an upstairs window, Eliza watched with unflinching stillness, though her hands trembled. Below, Samuel and several others stood between the quarters and the riders, not with weapons, only presence. The message was clear. Ashford's experiment would not be welcome. By morning, fear had settled over the plantation like fog. Mary urged Samuel quietly, "We could leave. Head north before roads close." He considered it. War was brewing. Travel would soon become impossible. But leaving meant abandoning the fragile chance Eliza had created. Later that day, Samuel sought her out beneath the old oak near the fields. "They're trying to frighten you back into line," he said. "They are succeeding," she admitted softly. "But fear does not mean retreat." He hesitated before speaking again. "If you move forward with this, it will not only cost you your standing. It may cost your safety." She looked toward the main house, once a symbol of comfort, now collateral. "I was raised to believe safety was the highest virtue," she said. "But safety built on injustice is only illusion." Silence stretched between them, not as mistress and laborer, but as two people standing at the edge of history. In town, secession was formalized. Louisiana would leave the Union. War was no longer approaching, it had begun. And with war came opportunity and peril alike. Old laws would strain. Old hierarchies would crack. The bank sent final notice, 60 days remaining. Eliza gathered everyone at dusk beneath the spreading oak. "I cannot promise certainty," she said to them. "But I promise this, no one here will be sold while I draw breath. And if this land survives the coming storm, it will survive differently than before." For the first time, hope was not whispered in corners. It stood in the open air. But storms do not pass gently. And as cannon fire sounded faintly in distant cities, Ashford Plantation braced itself for the greater test yet to come. War remade everything faster than Eliza Whitmore could have imagined. By the time cannon fire thundered at Fort Sumter, the South was no longer whispering about division, it was living it. Young men who had once criticized her from polished saddles were now marching in gray uniforms. Supply lines shifted. Cotton shipments stalled. Banks tightened their grip. And in that chaos, Ashford Plantation stood at a crossroads. The deadline from the bank loomed like a storm cloud. 30 days. Eliza had already sold the southern acreage quietly to a merchant in New Orleans. The payment cleared half the debt. The rest would require something unthinkable. She gathered the plantation community beneath the oak once more. "I can free you in writing," she said, her voice carrying through the heavy air. "Legally. Permanently. But once the papers are signed, the protection of this property changes. Some of you may need to leave for safer territories." A hush followed. Freedom. The word felt too large to fit inside a single afternoon. Samuel stepped forward slowly. "If we leave, where do we go?" "The war is spreading. Roads are watched." Eliza nodded. She had thought of little else for weeks. There are Union-controlled areas forming along the Mississippi. Refuge camps. It is not comfort, but it is lawful protection. I have written ahead. Mary clutched her son tighter. "And you?" she asked Eliza softly. "What becomes of you?" Eliza allowed herself a small, steady smile. "I remain. This land must transform fully or fall honestly." Within days, documents were drawn. The lawyer from New Orleans returned under secrecy. One by one, signatures were made. Hands trembled, not from doubt, but from disbelief. Samuel was the last. He stood across from Eliza in the quiet study where ledgers once dictated fate. "You understand," he said carefully, "that once I sign this, I owe you nothing." "I know," she replied. "And you owe me nothing either," he added. A long pause passed between them. "That," she said gently, "is the point." He sighed. Outside, the world roared with war. But inside that room, Something far older than the conflict had quietly shifted. Weeks later, under cover of dawn, several families departed north along guarded river routes. Others chose to remain temporarily as paid laborers, wages recorded carefully in fresh books free from ownership columns. The bank, pressured by wartime instability, accepted final settlement through land sale and restructuring. Ashford Plantation no longer operated under its former model. It became smaller, modest, different, but not broken. Months passed. News arrived in fragments: Union advances, Confederate losses, rumors of emancipation proclamations being drafted in Washington. Change was no longer a question of if, but when. One evening, Samuel prepared to leave for good. Opportunities had opened farther north where reconstruction efforts were quietly beginning. Skilled men were needed. He approached the veranda, not as property, not as servant, but as a free man. "I wanted to say farewell," he said. Eliza stood without gloves now, without the rigid posture of her upbringing. "You owe me nothing," she reminded him softly. He inclined his head. "And yet I offer thanks." They stood in silence, aware that what had passed between them was not romance, nor rebellion for its own sake, but recognition. Recognition of humanity long denied. As he turned to go, the fields behind him no longer looked like chains of white cotton. They looked like land waiting to be redefined. The South was tearing itself apart. But on one small stretch of Louisiana soil, something new had already begun. The war raged for 4 long years, reshaping maps, laws, and lives. When the conflict finally ended in 1865, the nation stood altered forever. The institution that had once defined Ashford Plantation collapsed under the weight of history. Freedom was no longer whispered beneath oak trees, it was written into law. Ashford itself survived, though smaller than before. The grand columns weathered storms and seasons, no longer symbols of dominance, but reminders of change. Paid workers tilled the fields. Contracts replaced ownership. The land bore witness to transformation. Eliza Whitmore never regained her former standing in society. Some called her foolish, others dangerous, but a quiet few called her brave. Years later, a letter arrived from Samuel. He had built a modest life upriver, working as a carpenter. His son attended school, something once forbidden. His wife tended a small garden behind a home they owned themselves. He wrote only one final line that lingered in Eliza's heart. "Freedom began for us the night you chose to see us." And in the still evenings beneath the Louisiana sky, she would sit on the veranda, not as mistress of a system, but as witness to its end, knowing that on the last night of bondage, she had chosen courage over comfort.